Hey everybody, welcome. Surprise. Happy Friday to all of you. I'm so glad that we get together on Friday to talk all about the Daybell case because holy cow, is there a lot to talk about. So before I dive into the thing that you all have lots of questions about, which is the error in the indictment, I do want to go over a little bit of a recap of what happened since our last episode last Wednesday. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go witness by witness and point by point the way that we often do, but there were some high points that I really wanted to talk about. There were quite a few witnesses last week who came in to testify about Tammy Daybell's health, that she was healthy, that she was vital, that no one saw that she was ill, and that everyone was quite surprised when she died so suddenly. So there were quite a few of those witnesses. But I did think that a couple of the more interesting witnesses and significant witnesses were Jason and Samantha Gillum. Samantha Gillum is Tammy's sister. So Jason Gillum is Tammy's brother-in-law. Jason was the one who went with Steve. Now his name has escaped me, but I will find it. Who was the person who from the mortuary in Springville, and he was the one who transported Tammy's body. He went from Springville, where he was located, drove 4 hours. It's about 4 hours down to Rexburg to pick up Tammy's body. And Jason Gillum, because he had known Jason a long time, and they were all had lived in. Let me get my crap together here. They had lived in Springville all together, and he and Chad had been friends. So he wasn't really surprised when Chad called him and asked him to help make all the arrangements for Tammy. So he drove over to Rexburg, met with Chad, made all the arrangements, and Jason went with him. By the time they finished making all those arrangements and were prepared to pick Tammy's body up, it had already been embalmed by the mortuary in Rexburg. So they picked Tammy up and took her back to Springville. But Jason, of course, has known Chad for a very long time, probably as long as he's been married to Tammy or close to that. He said he and Chad were close friends, and he said that the stories about Chad's near-death experiences at Flaming Gorge and later in La Jolla, California, expanded and went from something mildly spiritual to near-death experiences. And then Jason said that Chad said in 2013, so that would be 2 years before he and Tammy left Springville and moved to Rexburg, Chad was already saying there were going to be 2 earthquakes, major earthquakes along the Wasatch Front, and it was going to cause chaos in Salt Lake, and that there would be invading troops from China and Russia that would be attacking the United States. Jason said he thought that was very much a fear tactic on Chad's part to make people think he knew more than everyone else. Chad asked Jason and Samantha to move to Idaho. He wanted them to escape the tribulation and told them that Rexburg was going to be a place of refuge. Originally, Jason believed Chad's and his beliefs and visions. He believed in Chad and Chad's beliefs and visions. They visited, Samantha and Jason visited Rexburg, but declined to move. Then Chad wrote them a letter in 2016 saying the earthquake would happen in 3 years. Chad said Samantha was dark. Isn't that convenient? Anybody who thought that he was kind of crazy, or thought that he didn't know what he was talking about, or thought that church leadership would have a better idea of when the call-out might happen, any of those people all ended up being dark pretty quickly. He told them that Samantha wouldn't be allowed to go to Idaho and see the glory, that she wouldn't be allowed to go south because the dark spirits would hold her back. Jason felt like Chad Daybell. Now, in the LDS faith, the man of the house is tasked with the stewardship of his family, meaning the tending of his family. And I see people are posting questions already. That's great, because we're going to take a lot of questions today. So please do continue to post your questions. Jen will star them and we'll get back to them. So Jason said he felt that that Chad was trying to take the stewardship of his family away from him. And when Jason and Samantha were in Rexburg, Chad showed Jason around Rexburg and showed him where the tent cities would be. Jason said he felt uncomfortable and felt it wasn't right for them. Tammy Daybell, he said, was a kind, gentle person. And he said that Tammy wasn't thrilled about moving away from her family. Chad said his kids knew he was going to Hawaii to get married later on. And he asked the kids to keep it a secret. Chad said, "My kids are good at keeping secrets." While Jason was talking to the authorities, to the FBI, and they were asking Jason and Samantha if they knew where Chad was, Jason said, "I'll just call him and ask him." So he did, and that phone call was recorded, and that was played in court. Chad Daybell called Jason and wanted to know if Jason and Samantha had been behind the exhumation of Tammy's body. And Chad said on the day of her funeral, Chad said Tammy had appeared to him and told him it was time to move on. It wasn't until law enforcement, the FBI and the Rexburg police asked to speak with Jason and Samantha that he found out about the missing children. And during the conversations that Chad had with Jason, he was blaming Heather Daybell for all of the problems that they were having and the suspicion around Tammy Daybell's death. And Chad said this is a different issue that doesn't involve the Douglases. So Samantha also testified. Her testimony was similar. She also testified about the terrible vacuum that Tammy's death left within their family and how hard it was on their family. So then there were a series of witnesses. Nicole Heidemann was called back to talk about Chad Lori's wedding planning that was happening prior to Tammy dying. She also had the the job of reading all the sexy messages into the record. I'm sure that that felt somewhat awkward to her. We had Dr. Angie Christensen, who was the FBI forensic anthropologist. We had Ashlyn Rind, who was Tylee's best friend, and Dave Cincerbo, who is an Idaho State Police crime lab specialist. He's a forensic chemist, and he testified that there were accelerants present in Tylee's remains. Then Chuck Considis was back on the stand. He said that they were monitoring social media and saw some posts that included satellite photos of the Daybell property. He reached out to that company and got those cell phone images, or those satellite images. And it was very clear from those images, looking at before September 8th, after September 8th, and then before September 22nd and after, that there were changes to the Daybell property that indicated something had been buried there. Agent Nicholas Balance, FBI agent, was the one who talked a great deal about phones and CAS data. And so one of the things that he testified about was that Chad had a phone that he used, and used under an alias Boyd Dial. So that name comes up. We also found out that Alex Cox often went by Ray Lamar, and that's important because it's going to come up a little bit later. Tylee's phone, he said Tylee's phone was used in Hawaii after Tylee was dead. That showed Lori Vallow's phone was in the same area as Tylee's in Hawaii, and that Lori was continuing to send messages from Tylee's phone as if she were still alive. So now we got down to Wednesday. And we had Dr. Lily Marston, who was the Utah Deputy Chief Medical Examiner. She was participating in Tammy's autopsy and sort of bolstered the testimony we'd heard before. There wasn't anything new, but she kind of corroborated that testimony. There was more testimony done. There was more testimony from the FBI, Ricky Wright, having to do with the CAS data. And that was the point that John Pryor really sort of put him through his paces in terms of the CAS data. It sort of, I think, was a preview of what we can expect in John Pryor's defense case in chief, which is coming up. So then it is very typical in any kind of a criminal case to start and finish, sort of bookend all of the other witnesses with witnesses who really explain sort of the overview of the case in the beginning, and then at the end tie up the loose ends. So there were two witnesses that the state offered to do that, to sort of tie up the case and give it an overview. And the first one was Ray Hermosillo. Now, Hermosillo has been the lead detective for Redmond Police Department since this case began 4 years ago. So he is the one person who is absolutely intimately conversant with all of the facts of the case. So he was the person who came on, and he talked. The first thing was something we had not heard before. Now, we've known that there were hundreds of hours of jail phone calls between Lori and Chad before Chad was arrested in June of 2020. But we hadn't heard any of those except for the call that Lori made on our Chad actually made to Lori on, I can't remember now. I think she called him and then he called her back. I can't remember, but the phone call on June 9th between Lori and Chad when he was sitting in the driveway and they had found the first indication that there were remains in the backyard. But other than that, we had not heard phone calls between the two of them during Lori's stay in prison while Chad was still out until Wednesday. And on Wednesday, we got this jail phone call that Chad and Lori had. Now, I'm not going to be able to go over it. It's quite lengthy. And actually, the state only played portions of it. But it is fascinating. So I highly recommend that you go back and listen to it. If you don't listen to the whole trial, definitely track that down and listen to it. So what's interesting is that, as we said earlier, Alex Cox sometimes went by the alias Ray Lamar. And he actually had Lamar was his middle name. And he actually had an email, raylamar@gmail.com. But what's interesting is he and Lori are talking and he says to her, I texted Ray. This is very clearly a reference. As it goes along, it's very obvious that this is a reference to Alex. And Hermosillo makes that connection right away. And they begin talking about in metaphors, which is pretty interesting. They're really sort of dancing around. Chad's dancing around what he's trying to tell Lori. So Lori, he says, I asked him about what we talked about, and he's very optimistic. And she says, optimistic for you or for the project? He says, both. And then she starts talking about house renovation. She talks about the fact that she has been watching a TV program about renovating swimming pools. And she goes on to talk about TV shows. And she likens it to, in a lot of these programs, they start a project and it always takes much longer than they expect it to. In fact, she says, she's talking about the fact that the contractor says things like, we didn't realize that we had to move these huge boulders into your backyard for the waterfall, or we had to lift, we had to lift a crane, had to lift things over the top of your house. And then she says, we didn't know when we dug in your backyard what we would find. And that just seemed tremendously Freudian to me, because this is literally the day before. Thank you, Jerry. I see there's a super sticker there. Thank you so much. Oh, it's Jenny. Sorry, I can't read from that far away. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating because she says, we didn't know when we dug in your backyard what we would find. Then they go on to continue to talk about, and this call is the day before the children's bodies are found. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was the contrast between the two phone calls, the tenor and the sound of Lori's voice, the tenor of the phone calls, very different between the 8th and the 9th when the children's bodies are found. So then they go on to talk about, they're still talking about trouble. They're still talking about issues with their contractor and how long the project is taking, and that Ray is the contractor. But she goes on to say, you know, it's strange how the trouble blossomed. Do you think it was meant to have complications? And he says, I think we sensed that we shouldn't take it lightly, and we didn't. We only discussed the matter once with the trouble. Once I thought we only discussed the matter once with the trouble, and I thought we cut it off. But now that problem is causing its own trouble, which sounds to me very much like the investigation continuing into Tammy's death. And Chad says he thinks it was meant to happen. Of course he does, because otherwise he wouldn't be the prophet and the person who's predicting all of these things to happen if it didn't. And then the final witness was investigator Nicholas Edwards. And he is the investigator for the Attorney General's office. So I thought this was kind of interesting that they brought him in to be the one to do the wrap up, rather than having Ray Hermosillo do it, or rather than having somebody from the FBI do it. So if you recall, during the time that after Tammy had died and while the children were still missing, the Fremont County District Attorney, whose name is Marcia Murdoch, was the DA prior to Lindsay Blake being elected. She had decided that the county, thank you, Idaho Spud Girl, very kind of you. Marcia Murdoch had decided that Fremont County did not have the resources to investigate Tammy Daybell's death, and she asked to refer the case to the Attorney General's office. Now, that happens frequently in cases in small jurisdictions where they're asking for the assistance of the Attorney General in prosecuting the case. It wasn't until Lindsay Blake took the case over that she asked the Attorney General's office to give her back the Tammy Daybell case. And then later, when the children's bodies were found in Fremont County, that case, part of the case became Lindsay Blake's responsibility as well. So during that time, the Attorney General's office had done some pretty in-depth investigation. There were some really interesting things that I know we had not heard before. Now, we did hear, I believe it was the FBI talk about, no, I think it was actually the Fremont County Sheriff who talked about the incident that happened when Tammy Daybell was shot at. Tammy interpreted that weapon as a paintball gun. She had seen paintball guns before. Her kids had done paintball shooting. And she believed that what she saw on top of the gun was the hopper for the paint pellets. But investigator Edwards was able to compare the two guns, and they put pictures up side by side of a paintball gun and the Grendel gun, the AR style gun that was seized, that they believe shot at Tammy. That was Alex Cox's gun. So he said something which I thought was super interesting. Thank you, Kara J. He said something that I thought was really interesting. He said, in looking at the gun, and they qualified him as somewhat of a gun expert and particularly understood the way that assault or AR military style rifles work. He said that now he explained it, and I'm not a gun expert, so I'm sure that I'm going to butcher the explanation, but let me do my best. The stock on the Grendel folds, and actually you can take the gun apart and break it into two pieces. So what he said is that the place where the the gun comes apart, there are two receivers, and an upper and a lower. And he pointed out that the place where the pins go that pin the gun together were loose. And only one of those pins was present, and it was loose. He said it was highly possible, likely in fact, that after the first shot, the gun malfunctioned because of that missing pin. And he said that it was. He also talked about the fact that the gun was the muzzle of the gun had been threaded to take a suppressor. And a suppressor is intended to suppress the sound, but it doesn't make the gun silent. It will make, the gun will make sort of a whooshing sound when a bullet is fired. So he believed that what Tammy interpreted as the whooshing sound of a paintball gun being fired was actually a bullet being fired, but that the gun malfunctioned after that first firing. And because Tammy said he kept pulling the trigger, but nothing happened. She thought it was empty paint pellets. But it is very likely that it was, in fact, missing from, it in fact had malfunctioned, and he kept pulling the trigger. So then Wright went on to talk a bit about the night that Tammy Daybell died and the phone pings that happened during that time. And he went through all of the text messages and how things stacked up. And I thought that was the first time we'd really seen this timeline. So I want to go through it just quickly. He says that Alex Cox was at the church, which is 2.6 miles away from Chad Daybell's property, from 10:07 to 10:45. So he, the first thing that happens is between 6:13 p.m. and 8:24 p.m., Chad and Lori exchange 6 text messages. Now, at this point, Verizon did not store text messages, so they weren't able to retrieve them because they've been deleted off everyone's phones. But the text messages were flying around furiously. Those 6 messages went back and forth between Chad and Lori between 6:13 and 8:24 p.m. Between 6:56 and 8:24 p.m., there were also 6 messages that went back and forth between Chad and Alex. At 8:44, Chad sent Alex 1 text message, and then between 8:47 and 9:04, Lori and Alex exchanged 12 text messages. Between 8:52, Lori sent Chad a message. At 9:35, Alex sent Chad a message. Then at 9:43, Chad sent Lori a message. Now, here's an interesting little tidbit. Between 9:59 and 11:12, so right at the time that Alex was in the parking lot at the LDS church up the street from Chad's property, Lori and Zulema exchanged 11 different text messages. So Alex arrives at the church at 10:07. Between 10:12 and 10:28, he and Chad exchanged 4 messages. And then at 10:22, Tammy Daybell's phone is active. She is playing games on her phone at 10:22. At 10:23, between 10:23 and 10:54, Alex and Chad exchanged 10 text messages. At 11:28, there's a single image deleted from Tammy Daybell's telephone. And between 11:34 and 11:35, Chad and Lori exchanged 2 messages. Then at 11:46, Alex leaves the church and he heads out. Between 11:53 and 12:09, Alex calls Lori. And then at 12:35, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow text. Now, the interesting thing is that Alex leaves the LDS church near Chad's house at 11:46. He talks to Lori until 12:09. During that time, he drives the 30 minutes between Chad's property and Idaho Falls and checks into a hotel in Idaho Falls and stays the night. The next day, Chad reports that Tammy has died in her sleep the next morning. Now, the very last witness was Doug Hart, and he goes through a very detailed breakdown of the wrap-up of the case. So if you're interested in sort of the tying up of all the loose ends, that would be a good witness to listen to. Because the next thing that happens is some serious drama, and that's what I want to talk about. So the defense, the judge asks Lindsay Blake whether or not she has any other witnesses, and she says she doesn't. And he says, does the prosecution rest? She says, may we have a quick sidebar? They go off together and chat for a few minutes. Lindsay Blake comes back and she says, the prosecution rests. The court asks John Pryor if he has any motions. He says he is going to make a motion for a directed verdict, which is a very standard, typical motion. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the judge says to the jury, the jurors, now it's fairly early in the day and it's before lunch, and the judge says to the jurors, we anticipated that we were going to end early, so we didn't order your lunch. And but I don't want you to leave yet because I want you to meet with the jury commissioner. The jury commissioner has some information for you. So I'm thinking, what does that mean? And the judge says, I'm ready to take Mr. Pryor's motion, but I also want to meet with the jury and the jury commissioner first. So he goes off the record and meets with the jury and the jury commissioner. Now, here's what I think was going on. Unlike the last five weeks that we have been, almost 6, that we have been watching this case, the jury, during that first, where the prosecutor has been presenting their case, the jury has not been sequestered. They've gone home every night and they've been directed not to talk about the case or listen to any news about the case. And every morning they've come back, signed an affirmation saying that they didn't listen to anything or watch any news coverage of the case. But once the penalty phase begins, by statute, they have to be sequestered. So I think the jury commissioner was talking to them about the possibility of them being sequestered and what that was going to look like for them. So the judge comes back out. John Pryor makes his motion for a judgment of acquittal. Now, this happens in every case. It would be reversible error on the part of and malpractice, frankly, on the part of John Pryor if he were to not do this. So he makes his motion for He makes his motion for a judgment of acquittal. And essentially what a judgment of acquittal says is, Judge, I believe that even if you took all the facts in the light most favorable to the prosecution has not proven their case. Judgments of acquittal are incredibly rare. They happen on very, very infrequent occasions. They happen occasionally, but if I had to put percentages out there, I'd say 1% or less of the cases ever would be dismissed based on a judgment of acquittal. So I think the judge the next thing that happens, sorry, I was looking at something in the chat, I know better. The next thing that happens is the judge has to sit down with the indictment, the charging instrument, and look at every element and whether or not the prosecution, taking all of the inferences in the prosecution's favor, whether he thinks the prosecution proved their case. So he goes through the indictment line by line. While he's doing that, he points out to the prosecution that the date on count 4, which was J.J. Vallow's murder charge, is an improper date. That the date reflects the Tylee's dates. The date range is Tylee's date range. And the prosecution has already rested. So he says, I'm going to give you 2 hours to both do a little legal research and so that you both can, I'm going to give you 2 hours for both of you to do the legal research and come up with your arguments and come back and present legal arguments to me about what we should do about this. And I'm telling you, it sent shockwaves through the internet. It sent shockwaves through social media. People were in an absolute panic. And I understand why, because the remedy would have been the dismissal of that count, of count 4. And I am certain that it caused Larry and Kay a tremendous amount of distress. I didn't think it was that big a deal, to be honest. Having seen how Judge Boyce dealt with the earlier issues with the indictment, I really thought that Judge Boyce was going to find a way to make sure that the charge stayed in place. Now, do I think this is potentially an appellate issue for John Pryor? Absolutely. It's going to be high on his list of appellate issues. But I kind of expected the outcome. And so I wasn't at all surprised when Judge Boyce found a way to continue to use the indictment and to sort of allow it to be changed sort of by finding that it was a typographical error. Now, the state came on and they went through all of the reasoning. Thank you, Polly Yo, so kind of you. They went through all of the reasoning behind what the options were. The judge could just find that it was a typographical error and could allow them to correct it. The judge could say that could point out in the biggest question is, how do you instruct the jury? And you have to make sure that the jury instructions match the indictment. So here we have a problem because the jury instructions are going to talk about the dates that J.J. Vallow was last seen, and all of the testimony is going to talk about how J.J. Vallow, when J.J. Vallow was last seen, and when the activity happened in Chad's backyard. But the actual indictment has the wrong dates on it. So there have been cases that permitted the judge to simply give a jury instruction explaining the variance, why there was a variation between the jury instructions and the indictment. And then the final argument, and I think this is probably what persuaded the judge more than anything else. The Idaho statute requires that before you amend an indictment, you have to get leave from the court once the indictment is filed. Now, let's just drop back just a little minute and talk about why the indictment is important. We've talked about this before, but I don't think we can go over it too many times. The indictment is important because that is the document that is served on the defendant that gives him or her notice of what they're being charged with, exactly what they're being charged with. And that is the document that then the defense is going to use to refute every one of the elements that the prosecution has alleged the defendant committed. So what the state said was, if we go back and look at Idaho case law, the dates are technically not an element of the crime. So now the judge he can fix a typographical error, he can tell the jury there's a variance, and he can also say, he can also tell the jury that the date is not a critical element, a required element of the crime. So the other thing that the state points out is that in order to amend an indictment, you have to have permission from the court. There has to be a court order that gives you leave to amend. So the only time that the judge allowed them to amend the indictments, it didn't apply to count 4, because count 4 wasn't one of the ones that had the issue about theft and cited the wrong statute. So the state was able to revise and correct those wrong statutes. But in the process of that, somehow a typographical error was added into the indictment in count 4, even though count 4 wasn't one of the ones that the court had given the prosecution leave to amend. So what the state argued was, it was never an amendment to the indictment, because the court never gave them permission to amend that count of the indictment. So I think, taken all together, the judge said, okay, this clearly was a typographical error. For years before the indictment was amended and that typo crept in, the defense was on notice that those were the dates of J.J. Vallow's alleged murder. And since the judge never gave anyone leave to amend that count, it very clearly was a typographical error. The judge then looked at the fact that the case law also allows him to allow a variance in the dates, and points out that the dates are not fundamentally required as an element of the crime. And the judge said, I'm going to find that that was a typographical error. I'm going to correct it on the record, and I'm going to essentially say no harm, no foul. Now, there is an argument, and John Pryor made it, that any deficiency in the indictment would justify that count, the court finding that that the prosecution did not prove that element, and so it should be dismissed. So, and it would be a dismissal, or the judge would find that the prosecution had not fully proved that count, and it would be a dismissal of just that single count. So, I'm sorry, I've been listening to court tapes for hours and hours so that I could sit down and go through all of this with you. So forgive me if I'm a little bit addled. The other thing is that I've been listening to them at 1.5 and sometimes 1.75 speed. So I'm feeling a little bit speedy myself. So the judge came back and said that he was going to find that the prosecution had never intended to amend the indictment as it applied to count 4, and that he was going to essentially say no harm, no foul. Yes, it is absolutely going to be an appeal issue for John Pryor. John Pryor is going to say that the judge should have granted his motion for acquittal as to that count, because the state did not prove the elements of the indictment as it reads in the indictment, meaning they did not prove J.J. Vallow died on September 8th and 9th in that window. I don't know that that's going to go anywhere. It seems to me that the case law is pretty well established on the issue of correcting an indictment. And so, but I do certainly think that it's a very fertile place for appeals. So now what happens? The prosecution has rested, and John Pryor is now going to put on his case in chief. So that's the way it works. The prosecution puts on their case in chief. During a case in chief, the prosecution presents questions all the witnesses on direct, and the defense then cross-examines witnesses. And there's different rules for whether or not you are presenting direct evidence or whether or not you are cross-examining a witness. If you are presenting direct evidence, you ask leading questions. The only exception to that is in cases where a witness has been declared hostile to the prosecution. We didn't have any hostile witnesses, and I don't believe we're going to have any hostile witnesses in John Pryor's case in chief either. So the case in chief now, the case in chief now switches over to John Pryor. And John Pryor is going to present his case. Now, what's John Pryor going to put on? Before the case started, John Pryor said he had a number of witnesses. He had a lot of people subpoenaed, and he said that he had 7 experts. We don't have any idea what those experts are, because those witness lists were not made public. Now, there are cases where witness lists are made public. The defense and the prosecution have to exchange witness lists. If there are experts on their witness list, they have to provide to the other side any reports created by the witness, and they have to provide that witness's qualifications as an expert, so their curriculum vitae. So, but since they weren't made public, we don't know who those experts are going to be. Now, we can surmise, we can sort of speculate that he's probably going to want somebody to come in and talk about DNA. He's also going to probably want somebody to come in and talk about CAS data. Now, if you have been a follower for a long time, you know that I have talked at length at different times about scientific data and how that is evolving, and how there are a lot of areas of the law that now are being considered junk science. If you're at all interested in that, in my newsletter archive, you will find a really a very deep dive into scientific evidence. And in that, I talk about the things that have been brought into question as scientifically questionable. One of those is ballistics information as it applies to tool marks. Now, that's different from a fired bullet. And we talked about this a bit in the Delphi case. So in the Delphi case, they recovered a bullet casing, or actually an unspent bullet. Let's get that right. An unspent bullet, so still had the brass jacket on it, near the bodies of the two girls that were murdered. And when they sent that off for analysis, they found that the prosecution or the state claims that the tool marks on that brass casing matched the tool marks in Richard Allen, in a gun that Richard Allen owned. Here's the difference between the two, and then we'll get back to talking about Daybell here. But this is the reason why a lot of scientific data is being challenged these days, because as science sort of makes leaps and bounds, there's much more fluidity in whether or not old forms of scientific evidence are reliable. So in the Delphi case, what they said was the marks that are on the brass casing are indicate that bullet was fed through the action in a gun that Richard Allen owned. We saw that same evidence in Murdoch. Now, it wasn't challenged in Murdoch, which I was very surprised about. But what the difference is, when you have a bullet that get the projectile and it fires out of the rifle, or barrel of any gun, every gun, as a bullet goes through it, gets scored by every projectile. And so that particular gun starts to have its own characteristic striations and scratches and marks inside the barrel. And then as the projectile is fired, because the projectile is softer than the barrel, that imprint imprints on the projectile. And that makes way more sense because it is individual to that gun. On the other hand, if you were to compare many guns of the same make and model, you will find that the same gun will leave the same extractor marks on the brass. The same make and model of gun, more than one of those guns will leave the same marks, extractor marks, on the cartridges. So it is a far less reliable form of identification. That's the point. So criminal defense attorneys across the country have been challenging that extractor mark science. And so I think we're going to see similar challenges that Pryor is going to bring. And one of those challenges is going to be to the CAS data. Now, CAS data is not new. I mean, phone location data, satellite, Wi-Fi, all of those phone location, and being able to triangulate someone's location based on the cell towers that their phone connects to, that is not new information. But what the FBI did was they developed an entire new formula, a whole new algorithm for how they interpret that raw data. That's CAS data. And there are a lot of smarter people than me who have looked at that and said, hang on a minute, I'm not so sure that what the FBI says adds up. So there has been a move in the defense community to challenge cast data, just like there's been a move throughout the country in the public defense community to challenge bullet extractor marks. So I think we're going to see someone come, and I think that John Pryor telegraphed that a bit, because as he's been cross-examining some of these the FBI's cast experts, he's been really pinning them down. He's been really making them be very specific and pinning them down and kind of putting them through their paces when it comes to that data. I think the reason why is because he's got a cast data analyst. Now, is this going to change the narrative? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to change what the jury has been presented. I don't think it's going to change, because the cast data is only one small part of a much bigger picture. Now, it's an important part, because as we saw, it locates Alex Cox in the church up the street the night that Tammy Daybell dies. It locates Chad and Alex in Chad's backyard during the critical times when the bodies were being buried. I mean, it's important data. But I think that taken as a whole, I think that the jury has enough information to be able to connect those circumstantial links in that chain. So we can go back and talk a little bit more about circumstantial evidence and how it's playing out in this case. So I think the other place that he is going to call somebody is going to be the DNA evidence. Now, I don't know at this point that he's really got a lot of room to challenge the actual DNA findings. I'm not sure about that. But I do think that he is going to, and I was very surprised that Lori's attorneys didn't do this. He's going to talk to an expert about how easy it is for hair to be transferred among people who live together, and how easily it could be, how easily Lori's hair could be in the duct tape around JJ. Other than that, I don't know, but we have heard that he is going to call some of Chad's children. Chad has 5 kids. We have heard that he's going to call 3 or 4 of them. I think that is incredibly difficult for Chad's children. And I want to just go down this little rabbit hole for a minute, because it's really difficult when you are a person who has been raised in a culture, in a high demand religion culture. Now remember that Chad's children, Chad was raised as a very devout member of the LDS Church, and he raised his children the same way. And so I think that it's important to remember that when we are talking about why Chad's children would continue to support him in the face of all of this really overwhelming evidence that he was in some way responsible for their mother's death. And I think that is a really hard question. You know, y'all know I'm not a psychologist. I don't even play one on TV. But I've studied human nature and human psychology an awful lot in my role as a criminal defense attorney. And I think that it is really difficult when these young people have already lost their North Star. They have lost their mom. And the only thing that they're hanging on to at this point is hanging on somehow to their dad. I suspect and speculate that they're all in slightly different places emotionally as to as to the support of their dad. But we also heard during this trial that Tammy knew and understood Chad's dark and light rubric, and that had been explained to her. And we also knew that that they bought into it. We know that at some point, Chad made sure all his kids got to Rexburg because he told them if not, they were going to be assailed by dark spirits. We know that Chad, at one point, Tammy and Chad had a video call set up with Mark. He was in South Africa on his mission, and they had set up a video call, and his camera wasn't working. And Tammy messaged him and said, "Oh, don't worry, it's cursed, but your dad's working on it." There were times when he asked, what happened in my body scan, and they told him that that they had cut lots of cords and there were lots of weapons that were threatening him. Very typical language that Julie Rowe used, that people who do energy work use, and common terms that Chad was using as he was talking to his followers. So it's very clear that these young people began in a high demand religion, and in a religion which criticizes people thinking independently and looking for answers outside of the faith. It is a high demand religion that requires that families submit to the head of their household, their priesthood holder. And that was the environment that they were brought up in. And so it's important to remember that is their frame of reference. We don't know whether they actually have any other frame of reference than that. So they have wholeheartedly embraced Chad and his beliefs. So the other thing I want to talk about is circumstantial evidence, because this is largely a circumstantial case. And the jury is going to get a jury instruction about how they weigh circumstantial evidence. Now, circumstantial evidence is just as good, carries just as much weight as direct evidence. Let's talk a little bit about the difference. The prosecution actually gave the example that I'll use. But let's say that you go out to get in your car and you look up and water is pouring off of the roof of the building you're in, and you step outside and immediately your face is wet, your coat is wet, and by the time you get to your car, you're soaking wet. That would lead you to observe it's raining outside, right? But what happens if you go to your car after having been in a building all day where you couldn't see outside, and you look around and you see the grass is wet? Well, you might think that the sprinklers have been on, but then you go a little further and you see the sidewalk's wet, and the road is wet, and there's water droplets on your car windshield, and the whole world is wet. Then it would be reasonable for you to conclude that it rained while you were inside the building. That's circumstantial evidence. You didn't see it rain, so you don't have direct knowledge of it. But common sense would tell you that if everything's wet, it rained. That was the example that the prosecution used when they were talking to jurors about, prospective jurors actually, about circumstantial evidence. So let me grab a drink here. So circumstantial evidence, and the way I like to think about it is two examples that help me describe it. If you want to get from A to B, you have to do you have to go through a series of waypoints. Or if you want to string together a bunch of facts, you have to link them together like links in a chain. Now, a link can be missing, and you can still make the connection that those links ought to go together. The other way I explain it is, let's say you have a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle. And the jigsaw puzzle is a picture of a pasture, a pastoral scene with a red barn and some livestock and a fence. And you start putting it together. So you start out and you find all the flat pieces. So you know you've got all the borders, and you fill in all the borders, and then you start filling in the pieces. And over here you fill in this red barn, which you know from the picture is in there. And then you look over and there's this sort of brown blob. And you think to yourself, well, something brown goes in there. If you can look at that space and say, from what I can see of this puzzle, I can tell that that brown blob is a cow. That you have just made a leap of circumstantial evidence, because there's enough of that outline that you can tell it's a cow. You just don't have the piece that has the cow's face on it yet. If, on the other hand, you look at that brown blob and you say, it could be that it's a dog, or it could be that it's a cow, or it could be that it's the trunk of a tree. And I don't know. That, my friends, is reasonable doubt in a circumstantial case, because you cannot make that leap in any way beyond a reasonable doubt as to what that image is, that brown blob is. So that's reasonable doubt in a circumstantial case. That is what the jury is going to have to think about as they are weighing all of the evidence. So I'm going to pull out my crystal ball, and I'm going to say that on Monday, John Pryor is going to present his defense. I believe that that is going to take a day, maybe 2 days. At that point, the case is going to go to the jury. I think we are going to have a verdict by next Friday. That is my reading of the tea leaves, my looking into the crystal ball and trying to make some predictions. But I think we will have a verdict a week from today at the latest. Then what will happen is the court will convene the penalty phase. The penalty phase will be when the prosecution will present their evidence as to why the jury should impose the death penalty. It will also be the time when the defense will present their evidence as to why Chad Daybell's life should be spared. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say that I believe that by next Friday, we are going to have a guilty verdict. I believe that the prosecution has presented a masterful case, and I believe that the jury is going to find Chad Daybell guilty. And I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say, because it's Idaho, that I believe that they are going to impose the death penalty. Now, I'm making that prediction, so y'all need to hold me to it. And if it doesn't come out that way, we're going to have a lot to talk about. So I think that we're going to have a verdict by Friday, and I think we're going to have a verdict in the penalty phase by the following Friday. I do not think the penalty phase is going to take 2 weeks. So you guys can hold me to it, and let's see whether my prognostication is right. Now we're going to take some questions, because I know you guys have a lot of questions. Now, Jen has been starring questions. She usually tries to group them sort of in similar fact areas, so similar subject matters. So she sometimes takes them out of order, but she is going to be looking for your questions. So please post your questions. While Jen is doing that, I want to give you an update about the book. The book, the final version of the book has gone to my publisher a couple of days ago. The next thing that will happen is it's going to be typeset. Yeah, Jen is asking you, please type the word question or capital Q's all in caps so that it's easy for her to catch them, because she is she's cruising through the chat. So if we do not answer your question in the next little while, repost it, please. Put repost in there so that we know you're posting it a second time, and we will get to it, because I really want to take the time to answer all your questions today. We've left almost an hour to take questions, and that's where I want to focus. So while we're talking about the book, and let me just finish that little conversation before we get to questions. The book has gone to the publisher. I did get some really exciting news. The publisher has chosen a producer for the audiobook. So for those of you who are asking if there's going to be an audiobook, there absolutely is. And that should come out, the release date should be the same as the hard copy of the book. Now, if you join the Book Launch League, you will get a PDF of the book as soon as it is finished being typeset. You'll get an initial PDF of the book. I would love it if you would read it in advance and be ready to post a review once the release date hits. It's super important, because if you get to 60 reviews, let's get the numbers right. If I get to 60 reviews on Amazon, whether they are good, bad, or indifferent, I hope they're going to be good. That puts us into the advertising algorithm for Amazon. And it means that we will be able to, will come up in people's, Amazon will start recommending the book. It will come up in the recommended for you portions of people's searches of their pages. So that's super exciting. So the audiobook is going to be under production. It will be released in Kindle, in a Kindle version as well. Once the PDF version is perfected, that will be what you will be able to get on your Kindle as well. Super excited. We are, hang on, I got to look at my phone because I have a countdown clock. We are 12 days from me leaving for CrimeCon. So that is the next thing that we need to conquer. Super excited about that. For all of you who are going to CrimeCon, I'm going to have a table in the creator area. They used to call it Podcast Row, but now they're calling it Creators Row, I think. I'll have a table there. We're going to be handing out swag. I'm going to be signing book plates for anybody who advanced ordered, and we'll be handing out stickers. And I'm just excited. I get to meet all of you. And there are lots of people who I've said, come by and collect your hug. So I'm super excited about that. On to questions. Dana Morrison, do funeral directors have any responsibility to report suspicions to authorities, especially for a seemingly healthy person when the funeral arrangements are being rushed, as in Tammy's case? You know, I would say that this is likely controlled by the individual state law. As we all know, most law is state law. I would suspect that this is that it is part of it is part of Idaho's state law and would be within the regulations of funeral directors. What I think is that if the funeral director knows that the medical director, the medical the coroner in this case. If this funeral director knows that the coroner has been involved in the case, then I don't know that the funeral director has any responsibility to report to the police, because it's the coroner's job to do that. Now, in this case, the funeral director lived in Utah, so that may put a little wrinkle into things, because the funeral director who took care of Tammy's funeral arrangements and arranged for her to be buried in Springville was a Utah funeral director. So I don't know about Utah. However, when the funeral director was on the stand and John Pryor asked him that question, he said, I might not feel a responsibility to report because I knew the coroner had been involved. Now, we know that the coroner did a terrible job, and we know that ultimately Tammy's body was exhumed, and the medical examiner in Utah then, after their findings, the Idaho coroner, Brenda Dye, revised the death certificate to reflect the ME's findings. So, good question, Dana. Dana or Dana. Some people pronounce it Dana. Hi, Dawn. Question, am I going to write a book on Chad's trial? Well, what I am doing, because so much of what happened in the case really applied to both Chad and Lori. The book really basically talks about the evidence against and the story as it relates to both Chad and Lori. And the final chapter in the book is being written as we speak, as Chad's trial goes along. My publisher is holding the book so that we can pop that last chapter and the epilogue in once we have a final decision in Chad's trial. So I am still following it just as carefully as I did Lori's. I have been doing a lot of it from home. I have to admit, the traffic in between where I live in Meridian and downtown Boise has gotten monstrous in the last year, just in the year since Lori's trial. I think a lot of people were still working from home when Lori's trial started. And this year, the traffic has just gotten terrible, so that it means that I have to, for the 20-minute drive from where I live into downtown Boise, takes me an hour. So I have been being a little bit judicious about, or one might say lazy, about actually going into trial. I am going to be there on Monday. I will be getting up bright and early and standing in line, because I'm pretty certain that there's going to be a lot of people who want to attend on Monday, because it is the start of the defense. So I am going on Monday, and I will be continuing to cover, and I will be continuing to finish that last chapter, and then we're gonna plop that into the book. So good questions. Sherry Kenworthy. Question, why does John Pryor have it in for Rob Wood? I don't know whether he does or not, but I will point out to everybody that early in this case, when Mark Means was still on the case for Lori, there were allegations, and they're only allegations because the judge sealed all the documents. So until those documents are unsealed, we don't know the details. But it has been alleged that there was some misconduct on the part of the prosecutor and the part of law enforcement early on. And that misconduct was that they were all in a social media group, and they were sharing their opinions and photographs and those sorts of things of the case, which would have been very ill-advised and would have been very improper. So we don't know that for sure, because those files haven't been released. And yes, I am very much filing FOIA requests just as soon as, and motions to unseal if necessary, to get those records, because I still want them, even though the book itself is finished. There are a lot of unanswered questions that we probably won't know until we have access to all of that information. Not everything that law enforcement knows makes its way into the prosecution's case. So it's very possible my book is coming out in hardcover, and it is very possible that when it comes out in paperback, there'll be an update. So stay tuned. Hi, Kara. Do you think Audrey B. will be called to the stand for the defense? I know Chad gave her a perfect or near perfect rating. I was surprised she wasn't called yet. I don't see any reason that they would call her. And I think it would draw a real relevance complaint from any of the lawyers. Let's remember that, yes, Audrey knew Chad and was acquainted with him, but it was Lori that she was really aligned with. And it was Lori that she made those threats, it was Lori that made those threats to Audrey. So I don't know that it has a tremendous amount of relevance as it applies to Chad. And I think the judge could very well say, this witness isn't relevant. And I think that's why the prosecution didn't call her. And I really don't see any reason why, how it could help Pryor in his case. There's no kidding. What she had to say was interesting and certainly bolstered the idea that Lori was in on the thought that people, hi, this girl, thank you so much. I appreciate your support, and you are so welcome. I love answering questions because y'all make me think. And I love the fact that we get to dive deep into these legal nuances. So I appreciate your support. Thanks. So I don't think Audrey would be relevant really to Chad's case. And I think that's why we didn't see her. Gerber Daisy, one of my favorite flowers. Whatever happened with Mark Means' state bar investigation? Any outcome? Well, this is interesting. Now, in a lot of states, my home state of Oregon, where I'm hoping to be back being a member of the bar soon for the purpose of doing some pro bono work once I get moved. But in the state of Idaho, they do not release information. In my home state, if there is an open complaint against you as a lawyer, the public has access to that information, and they have access to the file. They have access to opening up the file and getting a copy of the complaint, and even if it hasn't been adjudicated yet. Idaho, on the other hand, does not release any information about complaints against lawyers unless and until, and that's important, it's been adjudicated. So what we know about Mark Means is that he resigned from the Idaho bar before the investigation was complete and his case was adjudicated. Because he did that, we will never know. So what I know is that he lists on his LinkedIn page that he is in Troy, Missouri. Remember, Missouri is supposed to be the place where the city of Zion is going to be built, according to LDS tradition. And there's every indication that Mark Means was an adherent of that same neo-fundamentalist Mormon philosophy that Chad was, and Christopher Perrette from Avow, and a lot of other people. So he is in Troy, Missouri, and he lists on his LinkedIn page that he is an attorney / professor, but he is not a member of the Missouri bar. So typically what happens when I first joined, when I first took the bar and became licensed, If you wanted to move from state to state, you actually had to take the bar exam in the receiving state. Over the years, they have developed a reciprocity process. So only about somewhere around 15 states do not offer reciprocity. Funnily enough, California and Hawaii, the places lots of people want to go, do not have reciprocity with any other state. But a lot of the other states allow you, if you have been, you passed a bar in your home state and have been a practicing attorney for a period of time, and you are a member in good standing, that's important, of your bar, you can ask to be admitted to another state's bar. Now, we saw Rachel Smith came and asked the court to allow her to appear pro hac vice. What that means is that you are admitted to practice in the state for the purpose of that particular case. And that is different than reciprocally. Oh, allergies are alive and well. Sorry for that. I didn't have time to even push the cough button. What that means is you are admitted to practice law in any form within that state. So when I moved from Oregon to Arizona, I applied for admission to the Arizona bar. Now, I never practiced in Arizona, but I wanted the possibility that I could if I wanted to. So I've been inactive in both the Oregon and the Arizona bar as a retired member for almost 5 years now. But thank you, Jacqueline. But I have applied to be readmitted to the Oregon bar only for the limited purpose of doing pro bono work. So I will continue, I hope, to do work for people who are unrepresented, or maybe do some work with the Oregon Innocence Project and some of the other things that are going on, like public defender pay and policies around public defenders. Those sorts of things I'd like to continue to be involved in. So I hope that answers your question. Mark Means, as far as we know, is not admitted in Missouri because I'm certain if he applied, couldn't prove that he was a member in good standing in Idaho. So any other questions for us? Question, caller Michelle, please explain what the penalty phase entails, i.e. will there be witness statements, etc.? Absolutely, there are witnesses. For the most part, they're character witnesses and witnesses about expert witnesses having to do usually with mental health. So in the penalty phase, what happens is now we've found a defendant guilty. Back in the 70s, when the Supreme Court found that the death penalty was unconstitutional, as it was written, the thing that fixed it for the states who wanted to keep the death penalty was to institute this two-phase system. So because the defendant had to have the ability to present mitigating circumstances to a finder of fact. It wasn't enough for it to be a judge. It had to be the finder of fact who determined their guilt or innocence, their guilt in this instance. So the penalty phase starts out, the prosecution puts on all of their facts for why they believe that the death penalty should be imposed. So they're going to talk about how heinous the crime was, the fact that JJ was a young child, Tylee was still a minor. They're going to go through every bit of that evidence for all the reasons why what they did was particularly heinous. And then the defense is going to take over and they're going to present the information about Chad's character, why he shouldn't be, the death penalty shouldn't be imposed, why he is salvageable, why he can be rehabilitated, and why he should receive the only other alternative, which is life without parole. Now, it may be that we do not see Chad's children during the guilt and innocence phase, and that they will be called during the penalty phase. If they're called during the penalty phase, they are going to be talking about what a great guy their dad was, what a great dad he was, what a great husband he was, all of those things, in order to try and convince the jury that the death penalty should not be imposed on him. So I think that's going to be a tough mountain to climb, and I am predicting that they will find that he should get the death penalty. I had a question in my emails, and I'm going to answer it because I want you to know I read my emails. So the person asked me about impeachment and said, on the one hand, we have John Pryor wanting to use information to impeach a witness, but we also had John Pryor saying he wanted to see Rob Wood impeached. Okay. Well, these are two different ways that we're using the word impeach. So let's talk first about how it's used in court. If you are using it, if the word impeach is being used in court, what we're saying is we're going to use a fact or a piece of evidence to impeach the credibility of the witness. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a quick example that John Pryor used. He would say to a law enforcement person, well, isn't it true that he would call them into question their training or their expertise, or that would be a way of impeaching a witness. The other way to impeach a witness is to bring to light a conflicting statement that witness made. So if there was a conflicting statement, say in the preliminary hearing, let's say Melanie Gibbs said one thing in the preliminary hearing, and when she comes to testify in Chad's trial, she says something different, kind of opposite. Well, then John Pryor could take her testimony from the preliminary hearing and say, but isn't it true that in the preliminary hearing where you were also under oath, you said something opposite? So that's the way in legal terms we use the idea of impeachment. Now, in a governmental term, in a governmental definition, we're actually talking about a publicly elected person being removed from office. So when we use it that way, we're talking about impeaching someone and removing them from office, whether it's the president or whether it's the governor or whether it is an elected official. So John Pryor saying Rob Wood ought to be impeached goes to the fact that he believes that Rob Wood committed some sort of misconduct, official misconduct in his duties as a prosecutor. So I hope that answers the question about the two different ways that John Pryor talked about impeachment. John Pryor could have said, I think that he ought to be removed from office, or I think that he should, his voters should recall him. He could face a recall, but he used the word impeach. So Kathy Crosby. Hi, Kathy. Do you think Lori is watching the trial and realizes Chad is throwing her under the bus? I doubt that Lori has access. She very likely is getting updates through her Arizona attorney, her court-appointed attorney down there. because I'm sure they are watching it very carefully, because many of the same facts are going to be used in their case in September. So I'm sure they're watching, but I would be very surprised if she has access to watching a live stream of the trial. I think she probably is getting updates through her attorney. She may be able to see some snippets of it, but I don't believe that inmates in the jail would have that kind of internet access. Good questions, though. She may be getting updates through people who she is communicating with, like her family. I know that she still keeps in touch with her mom. Michigan 12. Chad is a serial killer. Why don't commentators use this term? Well, I think that if you were to ask the legal sort of law enforcement definition of a serial killer, yes, Chad qualifies. He killed more than one person at different times. Okay, so if we believe that Chad is guilty, then we can say he killed more than one person. They were killed at different times, and that is sort of the foundational minimum that we talk about if we're talking about a serial killer. But I think that the term serial killer has come to define and connote a different kind of killer. And I think the reason commentators, myself included, don't term Chad and Lori serial killers is because in our sort of parlance, in our in the today's environment, we put a different connotation on serial killers. We think of serial killers as people who generally have a sexual motivation. And there's no suggestion in any of these that there was any sort of a sexual motivation to what Chad and Lori did, other than the fact that they wanted to be together sexually. There wasn't any suggestion that they derived any kind of sexual pleasure out of killing someone. And I think that really is, although technically that's not the definition, I think that is what socially we've come to think of. We've come to think of the Ted Bundys, the Israel Keys, the potentially Brian Kobergers of the world as they're having a motivation of deriving pleasure from the act of killing someone. And I don't think that was present here. So I think that's why you don't hear them called serial killers. Although you're right, they do meet the definition, the sort of mental health and, oh, this is an interesting question. Jenny B. Who is the 3% person Lori was talking about being a problem for them? So that was a really interesting conversation within that recording. And I'm going to go back and sort of pull up my notes on it. So just bear with me here for a little minute. So as they were talking, what Lori said was the person who, wouldn't you know, it'd be harder to find my notes. They're there. What Lori said was the person who they asked assurance of, we don't know who that is. We can suspect that it may have been Ray in heaven. So what I've always said about Alex Cox is I still believe, and I think the content of that conversation, if you have a chance to go and listen to all of it, really bears this out. I think that Alex committed suicide. And I think that Chad and Lori had him convinced that he was going to the celestial kingdom to prepare for them and to help prepare for the second coming of Jesus. And I think that as they are talking about how long this construction project is going to take and how they had asked for guarantees and how they have already made their down payments, and they're talking about the project they're talking about is to move on all of these people and to bring on the second coming. Because Lori and Chad believed that they needed to clear the world of zombies before Jesus could come back. They needed to clear the world of evil spirits, and that was part of their mission. So I think that I think what they are saying, and this is speculation, so I want to be really clear that I am simply applying what I know about the case and about what other things have been said to my own speculation and trying to connect the dots, okay? So my thought is that they asked perhaps Ray in the celestial kingdom whether or not Tammy's death was going to cause them problems. And they were told by someone beyond the veil, possibly Alex, who is going by Ray, or possibly someone else that Chad is talking to through the veil. They were assured that they were given 100% assurance that it was not going to be a problem. Then Tammy's body gets exhumed and there's this investigation going on. Now, at the time they're having this conversation, it's the day before the kids' bodies are found. So we're not talking about the children, but we are talking about the ongoing investigation. And so what she says is, if we had known later, they're told that there was only a 3% chance that there would be, that they would not face complications and trouble. And they talk about the 3% person as the person who told them initially that they were okay, and then later revised that and said, oh, by the way, there's only a 3% chance you're going to get away with this. So I think it's kind of interesting that that happened. Tammy Daybell's body had already been exhumed. And I think that that conversation, as it referred to the trouble and how strange it was that it blossomed, and her asking, do you think it was meant to be that we'd have all these complications? He says yes. And I think they were talking about Tammy and about the fact that initially they thought they had gotten away with it, that everybody believed that Tammy's death had been from natural causes and they were home free. And then Tammy's body gets exhumed and there's this ongoing investigation. And by that time, they had also shared the results of the autopsy, although the public didn't know it. They had already shared the results of the autopsy with Tammy's kids. Emma and Garth both testified about learning about the results of Tammy's autopsy. So I think putting all of those little pieces together, I would say that they were talking in that regard. They were mad at the person who initially told them that it was 100% they weren't going to have any problems, who later revised their estimate down to, no, it's only a 3% chance that you're not going to have any problems. So that's one of the things Lori is bemoaning, is the lack of certainty in the outcome, and the lack of certainty as to when this project is going to come about. Because Chad says, we only discussed the matter once with the trouble, and I thought we cut it off, but we didn't. So it made me wonder whether or not at some point they had a conversation with Tammy about, we're going to be together, and you know, Chad can have more than one wife and we're all going to be together. And Tammy said, oh, hell to the no. And then they believe that they had quashed that by having her die in her sleep. So that's a really good question. And that's purely speculation because I do not know enough. And I think that might become clearer if and when we get all of the documents, because I knew that there are hundreds of hours. Ray Hermosillo says that sometimes Tammy and Chad, or, I'm sorry, Lori and Chad talked while Lori was in jail, sometimes 10 or 12 times a day. So there are hundreds of hours, just like there are of Charlie Adelson being bored and calling his mama. There are hundreds of hours of jail calls. So those will be interesting to analyze and to find out whether or not there's more information about those, about who was the person who was giving them assurances. But I do believe that if you put together the why do I have such a hard time with that word? The patriarchal blessing that Chad gave Alex just a week or two before he died, along with a few other things Alex said, and the fact that he went to Mexico and brought back medicine no one's ever been able to identify. I think you put all those things together, you could surmise that Alex committed suicide at the behest of Lori and Chad, because his mission was fulfilled and he needed to move on to his next mission. They do talk about how much he has done for them. So, good questions. Anybody else? Can Chad still make a deal? Hi, Judy. Technically, Chad could still make a deal until there's a verdict. But that would mean the prosecution would have to offer him a deal. And typically what happens, and I'm sure what happened in this case, is as soon as the jury was sworn, because when the jury's sworn, that's when double jeopardy attaches, when jeopardy attaches. So once the jury was sworn and the prosecution said, we're going full steam ahead on this case, all the deals came off the table. And I absolutely do not believe at this point the prosecution would ever consent to a deal. They know they have got Chad Daybell in their sights, and they have got to know at this point that there is a very good chance they are going to get the death penalty. And that being the case, I cannot imagine why, after they have gone through 5 weeks of trial, they would offer him to allow him to take a plea. You know, it does happen in criminal cases. If you remember, it happened in John Pryor's case. John Pryor was accused of some sort of sexual harassment or sexual touching of a woman, a young woman who was a potential client of his. He was charged. They got through a couple of days of trial, and he said to the prosecution, can I still take the deal? And they agreed. And he was able to plead it down to a misdemeanor, which meant that he kept his license. So he didn't lose his right to practice law. So we know it happens, but I cannot imagine that the prosecution at this point, having had to go through 2 complete death penalty trials, essentially, would ever agree to let Chad at the last minute plead it out. So I don't think there's any chance. Nikki Fife. Hi, Nikki. Do you think John Pryor will recall Melanie Gibb or Melanie Pulowski? So I know that he released, and let me just double check my notes to make sure that I get the right Melanie. I believe that he told the court that he was not going to be recalling Melanie Pulowski and released her from her subpoena. I don't believe he has released Melanie Gibb from her subpoena, but it wouldn't surprise me if he does. I think As often happens in cases, in criminal cases, the prosecution and the defense will go to the court and say, Judge, we both have witnesses subpoenaed, and we understand that it is a real imposition, especially in a lengthy case like this, to have somebody like Melanie Gibb, who lives out of state, come here and testify for the prosecution, and then 2 weeks later have to come back and testify for the defense. So often what happens is that they agree up front that the state and the court will give the defense some leeway, because typically what happens is you can only cross-examine someone on the facts that are brought up in direct. So in this case, Pryor would only be able to cross-examine Melanie Gibb on the things that the prosecution asked her. But I do think that both the prosecution and the court kind of gave Pryor some leeway in that. There weren't a lot of direction, or there weren't a lot of outside the scope objections by the prosecution. So I think if he got answered all the questions that he wanted, he may release Melanie, because remember, she is from out of town, and it is the defense's responsibility to bear the cost of bringing witnesses in. So they have to pay Melanie's expenses if she has to come back. And I think Chad's pretty short on money. Well, we know he is. We know he's indigent. We don't know how much the state is supporting that part of the trial. So we'll wait to see, but I kind of think they might not. Carolyn, the concept of a cult is never mentioned by prosecutors. Is this on purpose for the jury to connect the dots? I'm not so sure it's on purpose for the jury to connect the dots, but I think the word cult is kind of charged. It has some emotional baggage that goes with it. And I don't know that the prosecution wants to pigeonhole Chad's followers into that emotionally charged pigeonhole. Hopefully that makes sense. So I think it's just unsaid. Now, the jury could leap to that conclusion and say, holy cow, this is a weird group and it's a cult. They could. But if they don't, it's not going to matter to the prosecution, because they haven't alleged, oh, they're all part of a cult. Because cult has this kind of a specific definition and a specific sort of emotional connotation. So, I think that I was about to say in general, I think typically we try, whether you're the prosecutor or the defense, to keep concepts general rather than specific. Because if you keep the concept general, then the jury can go there. They can make it narrower. But if it doesn't, let's say they say, oh, Chad Daybell's a cult, and the jury gets back there and they say, well, this doesn't really fit into as a juror's thought of what a cult is. When I think of a cult, I'm thinking of the Moonies. I don't think of the Hare Krishnas. I don't think about Chad Daybell as a cult. Then the prosecution has sort of boxed themselves in, because they've said it's a cult. And now the jury's saying, no, I don't think it's a cult. We don't want the jury to get caught up on that stuff. So the more general the definitions can be, the easier it is for the jury to then narrow them down, rather than giving them narrow little boxes to put things in. I hope that answers the question. If it didn't, repost the question, please. After 2 hours, I'm afraid I start to wander a bit. So, Jill Leslie, this is an interesting term. I absolutely believe that if you look at the definition, and I'm surprised that this didn't come up more in either one of these cases, I really expected that we were going to hear from an expert who could talk about what a family annihilator is. Because it really is a mental health event. It's part of a mental health category, I think, in that we're talking about someone who, for whatever reason, kills the people closest to them. So no question, Chad Dorman is a family annihilator. No question. Some of the other cases that come to mind, Alec Murdoch, no question they are family annihilators. And I would absolutely put Lori and Chad both in this category. Now, Chad is a little bit less clear cut because he only killed his wife and not any of his children. But I think in Lori's case, you could certainly draw the conclusion that she is a family annihilator. And most certainly if you loop Alex Cox into that as well. So good point. And yeah, family annihilator is sort of a term. It's not really a legal term. So we don't see it coming up in legal cases as often as we see it in mental health experts testifying about the mental health of a perpetrator. So in cases where we have people who murder their families, yeah, mental health experts are going to use that term, but we don't see it really in the law. So, what is the weakest part of Tammy's case? As it is the weakest. Oh, and this is a repost. Thank you, Michigan 12, and thank you for reposting. It's so hard sometimes and questions get away from us. So absolutely, if we have not at this point answered your question in the chat, repost it. What's the weakest part of Tammy's case? And I think you're right. I think it is the weakest of the evidence chains. I think the weakest part is that we don't know who actually put their hands on Tammy and ended her life. Now, I will say that when you look at the text messages and the phone calls that we went over earlier in the show, I think it leaves a very clear picture of what was going on. Lori was in Hawaii. Zulema was in Arizona. And it was Chad and Alex who were there. Chad was in the house, and Alex was down the street at the church. It appears that he left his phone in his car while he walked or got a ride down to Chad's house, 2.6 miles away. And that he, sorry. And it appears that he and Chad were communicating very quickly and very much during those times. So I think what's telling is that we know at 10:22 that Tammy's phone was still playing games. She was still on her phone at 10:22. Her phone was still actively playing games. But at 10:23, Alex Cox and Chad exchange furiously between 10:23 and 10:54. They furiously exchanged 10 text messages. Then at 11:28, an image is deleted from Tammy's phone. And at 11:46, which would have been plenty of time for Alex to walk back to his car, he leaves the church and heads for Idaho Falls, where he stays the night in a hotel. So I think you can build the circumstantial chain. I think you can look at that blob and say the only thing missing is the cow's face. This is a cow. I can see the tail. I can see the legs. So I think what we had was I think Alex was there to either do the deed or to provide backup for Chad in case he couldn't do the deed. I think that those text messages between 10:23 and 10:54 were the coast is clear, the door is open, whatever. And then I think we see plenty of time for Alex to walk the 3 miles back to his car, the 2.6 miles, back to his car and leave. So I think Alex had a hand in it. Whether that was the plan or whether he came in as backup, I don't know that we'll ever know because Alex is dead and Chad's not talking. But that I think is we can surmise that Alex was involved. I think we can all also clearly surmise that it was he who was there and present to dispatch Tylee and JJ. I think that Chad was integrally involved in disposing of the bodies. Alex was not there very long on the morning that JJ's body was buried. So if I had to guess, the minute Tammy left for work, Chad was out there digging a grave, and Alex came by and dropped JJ off and helped cover it up. And I think that the day that Tylee disappeared, Alex was on the property longer. And I think that he and Chad together dismembered her body. So I was trying to say something like desecrated, but it didn't come out. So I think those are really good questions. Yes, I do. Oh, we still have over 40 questions starred. We didn't get to all of them. I read through the chat with my coffee over the weekend, and I have more time now that the book has safely been launched to the publisher, and I am only working on the Chad chapter. So I absolutely will. I'm going to go back through every one of those starred questions. I'm going to make sure that I make a note of them, and we will address them on Wednesday. I thank you and appreciate you for your patience in us not having a show on Wednesday. I was literally in the throes of the final markup of the book. And as the clock kept ticking down, I realized that there was just no way that I was going to be able to do the preparation that I like to do for you all and still be able to meet my deadline. So I'm really glad we got the opportunity to talk about this. Oh, hi, Ronnie. We are still collecting squares. So if you would like to do a quilt square for Kay and Larry, now I'm getting ready to move. My quilting stuff is packed up and I will be moving in early July. So don't look for this quilt to get finished until the summer sometime. However, we are collecting squares. If you would like to make a quilt square for Larry and Kay, we are doing what is a foundation pieced origami crane. In the Japanese culture, origami cranes are folded in memory of someone who has passed. And we thought that was a very fitting tribute to JJ. So in our description, you will find a link to my Google Drive where the pattern lives. It finishes to a 6-inch square. And the only thing we ask is that you put it on a black background. Use any color, any pattern you like. The more colorful, the better. I've received a few already, and I'd love to get more. Whatever we don't get from you all, I will make up so that we can have a nice size, probably lap size quilt in memory of JJ for Kay and Larry. And so please let me know. I had intended, before I put my house on the market and packed all my quilting things, to do a little educational video because not everybody has done foundation piecing. But in our description, I didn't get the chance to do it, but in our description are also some tutorials from our True Crime Quilt Guild, QUILT. And within those tutorials, the woman who designed the quilt has an education series on how to make those quilt squares. And one of them is foundation piece. So you can find it there, or you can just search on YouTube for a how-to on foundation quilting, foundation piecing, and you should be able to find something. So I just want to say thanks again for everybody joining us today. I hope you're going to have a great weekend. I am looking for, can we send actual origami cranes to fill the box with? I don't know how to quilt, but I'm great at origami. Please send me origami cranes and we will use them as the packing material for the quilt. That would be amazing. So absolutely do that. So I just want to say thanks for joining us. Thanks for always being here. I hope you guys all have a great weekend. We're finally getting some lovely spring weather in Idaho, and I'm finally to the point where I can take a day off. So I'm looking forward to maybe going out and seeing a few of the sites in Idaho before I'm out of here. So I want to say thanks to Jen, our moderator, who always shows up, so faithfully. Don't forget CrimeCon. We will be doing some shorts and some YouTube shows from CrimeCon, and hopefully introducing you to some of the creators that we run into down there. I know Joel from Surviving the Survivor is going to be there. I know that Pretty Lies and Alibis Gigi is going to be there. Defense Diaries, Allie and Bob Mata are going to be there, and I'm super looking forward to it. Brandy Churchwell is going to be there. If you are following the Reed case, she's been a big contributor to that. So we're going to be corralling as many people as possible and saying hello to them and sending you YouTube shorts. So I'm super excited. Don't forget that they may still be taking volunteers if you would like to volunteer and get a pass. So I'm going to say good night to all of you. Thanks again for being with us. Thanks to Jen. And I will catch up on all the questions and see you back here on Wednesday. Good night.